Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today in Militaria, we see a field bag used by a Canadian soldier in World War I, coveralls and medal from a soldier in the Canadian Women's Army Corps, and a marine chronometer used for navigation in World War II. Mark looks at a naval chronometer salvaged from the steam merchant Belgian soldier.
Well, I think it's interesting that the chronometer remained in the possession of the navigator, and many years later, the story has come full circle.
Gary looks at Major Mariel Mosier's coveralls and service medals from her time in the Canadian Women's Army Corps.
They're just not the stories that are told. It's easy to talk about guns, machines, and we don't often get to hear about the personalities behind those things, in particular the women's personalities.
Gary looks at a canvas backpack with a possible tie to the Canadian Expeditionary Force's 64th Battalion.
These are people that have been around in the community for a long time. This gentleman was born in 1898. This stuff all could have been lost if he didn't have the foresight to be interested in this heritage society.
My name is Shannon Baxter. I'm the collections manager at the Dartmouth Heritage Museum, which is here in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Today, I brought in a canvas backpack that was donated by a Walter Roland Simons. Sadly, we don't know too much about the backpack in terms of the military connections, so hopefully we might learn a bit more about that today.
The 64th Battalion was a short-lived battalion formed during the First World War that drew recruits from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island to provide reinforcements closer to the front line. The battalion was headquartered in Sussex, New Brunswick, where the infantry trained for almost a year before departing to England. Led by Lieutenant Colonel H. Montgomery Campbell, its maritime members served as reinforcements for the Canadian Expeditionary Forces already in France. For their efforts, the men were awarded the Battle of Honor and were later commemorated through a memorial bronze plaque carrying the names of the unit's 245 men who died during their service. The plaque was given to Sussex's Trinity Anglican Church by the 64th Battalion Association in 1931.
Welcome to Militaria, Shannon, and I was wondering if you could tell us what you brought in today.
So today I brought in a canvas backpack. It was donated to the Dartmouth Heritage Museum by Walter Roland Simons. And in the flap here, I'll just show it. It has the 64th Battalion. In terms of its potential military connections, we don't know too much about that.
Well, and as you said, this is a First World War backpack used by the Canadian Army in the First World War. The other thing, as you pointed out, is the annotation inside with the 64th Battalion. We know that that's a First World War unit. It's not from before the First World War because they were known as regiments then, and they're battalions in the First World War because we raised 260 infantry battalions in the First World War, 64th being one of the local ones. It was raised in Halifax. So this fits in to being from here and a First World War artifact. So Shannon, were you able to find out anything about Mr. Simons and his service during the First World War or the 64th Battalion in particular?
I couldn't find anything about his particular involvement. We do have photo albums from the family that show basically Halifax during the First World War, but not so much about the 64th Battalion, no.
So when I researched Simons, I couldn't find that he served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force and could not find that he was in the 64th Battalion. Obviously, this was his backpack. How he obtained it is, I guess, up to speculation, but I can find no evidence that he served in the Expeditionary Force. The provenance on it, on the other side of it, is the markings inside and that it's marked to the 64th Battalion. To me, I find that unusual because normally kit is marked to the individual and not the battalion. And it made me wonder whether, because they were a reinforcement, they were raised in 1915, maybe kit was not as accessible as it was later on in the war. That's where I'm sort of thinking where that's going, and to me, that's unusual. The 64th was raised in Halifax. They started recruiting in May in 1915, so it was one of the reinforcement units. And then in 1916, the battalion was broken up as reinforcements and absorbed by the 40th Battalion. Those soldiers would then have been sent to the units that made up the Canadian Corps that was actually in France and Belgium fighting. They never made it over to France to fight as a formed unit. They were strictly reinforcements.
I did learn quite a bit about my artifact today. It was really interesting to sort of learn more about the military background connected with it. So be able to sort of expand my knowledge in that way was really great.
So Shannon, you had said that Mr. Simons was an important part of Dartmouth's history and the history of your museum. I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Sure. So Walter Rowland Simons, he was one of the founding members of the Dartmouth Heritage Museum Society. He was born in 1898 here in Dartmouth. His parents were both immigrants from England. They moved here, raised their family. He lived primarily in the downtown Dartmouth area. So he basically spent his entire life here in Dartmouth and also taking photos of Halifax and Dartmouth as it grew. And later on in life, even though he was by trade an accountant and a bookkeeper, he grew a love of painting. So we definitely have a variety of artifacts within the collection from this family. So it's really cool to see sort of how he was involved within the community and then how he then sort of expressed that through art.
Like our museum, a lot of our founding members, I don't want to say emptied out their basements, but we received a lot of artifacts from them, and it sounds like this was the case there. And to me, that's important because these are people that have been around in the community for a long time. These artifacts are there to be exhibited and to tell stories of what's happened and how Dartmouth became what it is. So when was the society formed?
It was formed around 1962, and then the actual museum was established in 1967. They were collecting artifacts and then showing them in schools. And then 1967 is when the first Dartmouth Heritage Museum was built. It was on Wise Road. It stood there until about early 2000s, where unfortunately the building was condemned. It was a very sad day. They had to tear down the building, and a lot of our artifacts are now currently in storage.
So are there plans for a new museum?
That's the question we get so often, and unfortunately there's no clear answer on that. We're just trying to showcase artifacts where we can within the space we have, so the two houses and also online through things like Nova Muse. I wish I had a better answer than that. So what I think is important about holding on to artifacts like the bag I brought in today is that they help build a better picture of the story of the people who own them. Artifacts are just one of those pieces, that tangible item that people can look at and get a better sense of those stories.
So Shannon, thank you so much for bringing in this artifact and talking to us about Mr. Simons. Are there any plans in the immediate future for this artifact in the museum, or is it going back into storage?
For now, it'll probably go back into storage, but we actually did a exhibit a few years ago on Walter Simons' art, so it might be cool to sort of showcase more about his life and his story, and the backpack might be a feature there. I do appreciate learning more about where it might have come from. We have a large collection, so it's difficult to have everything on display at once. So for now, it'll probably be back in storage, but hopefully in the future, if we want to have an exhibit that focuses on the First World War and the Dartmouth connection, hopefully we'll be able to feature that.
Coming up on Militaria.
The fact that she joined right away shows that she was keen and she understood how she could contribute and how women could contribute. My name is Shara Kingston. I brought in the coveralls of Major Mario Mosher. The reason why I chose this artifact to bring in is I tend to lean towards women's stories. They're just not the stories that are told. It's easy to talk about guns, machines. We don't often get to hear about the personalities behind those things, in particular the women's personalities.
Before the Second World War, the female presence in the Canadian military was limited, not for a lack of interest or patriotism, but for a lack of positions for which they were deemed eligible. Determined to contribute at the start of World War II, women began to organise their own training in preparation for service. As the war escalated and Canadian forces needed to expand, their opportunity arose. The Canadian Women's Army Corps was an autonomous military branch authorised by the government to perform essential, non-combat services. By doing so, the men who had previously managed those roles moved onto the front lines. Over 20,000 women served between 1941 and 1946. Their integration became an invaluable source of support and opened doors for future generations who refused to let gender bias dictate their sense of duty.
So Shara, can you tell us what you brought in from the Army Museum today?
Absolutely, I'd love to. These artifacts belong to one personality, Major Mariel Mosher. I brought in a pair of coveralls that would have been worn by persons within the Canadian Women Army Corps. Brought in her Second World War medals, as well as her Order of Nova Scotia and her Sweetheart pin.
We've got a beautiful set of coveralls from the Second World War, and we know that by the ordnance stamp that is right there. That's an acceptance stamp. Her medals over here. She served during the war and after the war, and we know that because she has a Canadian Volunteer Service Medal with an overseas clasp. Judging by that, she served anywhere between 12 years and 21 years. So, Shara, do we know how we received these medals?
So, Mariel Mosher was on our first board at the museum. So, we opened the museum in 1953. She actually understood that we would want to have these as historical artifacts. I think what appeals to me about Mariel's story is she was a dancer, and she ended up leaving Canada to see out her dance career. And she came home in the summer just before September 1939. And as people did, reading newspapers could see that things were escalating. And instead of going back to live her life and be a dancer, she stayed in Halifax, and she joined a volunteer reserve corps and decided to start participating in these groups that got together well before the Canadian Women's Army Corps. They would figure out if they could go over what they could do and how they could support. I love that she kind of abandoned her one career to do something else. I think her brain was very academic, and her personality was a take charge personality. So I think this turned out to be a really good fit for her. And even throughout her military career, if there was downtime, she was teaching some of the girls how to do dance. You know, they'd have a few minutes and they would do dance routines.
The other nice thing I think about her is that after her life in the Canadian Women's Army Corps, and becoming a major is quite a big deal in the Women's Army Corps, she still did her dance, as you say. It was very important to her. Got her PhD, taught at Mount St. Vincent, and was thought of so highly that she was awarded the Order of Nova Scotia, which is not a military award. This is for service to Nova Scotia. You were quite right in saying she is quite the leader.
Yeah.
Provinces were looking at ways that they could recognize their citizens, because to get the Order of Canada is quite the honor, and it's not really all-encompassing to all Canadians. So provinces started saying, well, you know, we need to recognize those that are serving in our communities, not necessarily a national sort of service. So Shara, do you know when she received her Order of Nova Scotia and why she received it?
Yes, she received the order in 2004, and that was only 3 years after it being instituted in 2001. She received it for all of the contributions towards education and leadership in women's roles.
So the nice thing about these awards is that they're serial numbered. And this one is serial number 22. So we know that she is the 22nd recipient of the Order of Nova Scotia, which I think is quite significant. There's not a lot of them out there. It's a wonderful story about a powerful woman, what she was able to accomplish, fighting an uphill battle all the way, I believe. And it's a very good story that needs to be told, because it's not something we always think about when we think about the Second World War. So Shara, one of the big stories here, besides Muriel, is the fight that women had in order to be recognized, and the realization that they could contribute to the war effort, and not just by working in factories as they had in the First World War. The sacrifice that it took for these women to be recognized, and then the sacrifice afterwards once we're successful and got into the Army. And I was wondering, do you see that in Muriel's story?
Definitely. I mean, she started almost right away with the Women's Volunteer Reserve Corps. The fact that she joined that right away shows that she was keen and she understood how she could contribute and how women could contribute. There was a definite fight for women to get involved in the war. There were women who wanted to do more and do heavier lifting, so they got together and started learning trades. The hope was that they could push the government to creating a corps specifically for them. And it wasn't until March 1942 that the government finally rubber stamped it and said, okay, we can move ahead with the Canadian Women's Army Corps.
So Shara, I know that these medals are all on exhibit at the museum. However, these coveralls is a different story. These are going back into storage. What do you have to do to conserve the condition of textiles, especially because these things are about 80 years old, and there's worse looking things in my closet that aren't 80 years old.
Yeah, when we actually came across these coveralls, my summer student was delighted because she found an old tissue of Muriel Mosher's inside the pocket.
Yeah.
So the first thing is empty all the pockets. If you think there's been insect damage, we freeze our artifacts, and we freeze them for beyond 2 weeks. I usually do about 3, sometimes a month, and that is just to make sure anything that flew in and had babies will die. Then we would pack them and put them away for storage. I hope that at some point we do a really great exhibition about the different uniforms. With the Canadian Women's Army Corps, we are used to seeing the skirt and the blazer, and the coveralls are a little more rare. You don't get a chance to see those, so putting those out on display would be kind of my ultimate goal. But for now, we make sure they're covered and they're in a space where there is not a lot of moisture. We make sure it's climate controlled and taken care of that way, and no light hitting them.
Thank you so much, Shara, for picking Muriel and bringing in some of her artifacts to share on Militaria.
You're most welcome. So I think it takes a certain kind of woman to sign up for this, but they all really, really bonded, and it was a sisterhood of many senses.
Coming up on Militaria.
There was a large number of casualties because they were trying to launch lifeboats when the ship was still in motion. Carl Anderson, and I'm a member of the Canadian Naval Memorial Trust. I brought in a marine chronometer that was salvaged from a sinking freighter, the Belgian Soldier, a couple of hundred nautical miles east of Newfoundland in 1942. So the chronometer is 80 years old.
The Battle of the Atlantic was a fight for dominance over the North Atlantic Ocean, through which a constant stream of Allied provisions were conveyed under the protection of naval warships. From the onset of World War II, German U-boats were on a mission to disrupt and destroy the supply chain and relentlessly targeted the merchant navy. To add to the anxiety of the ever-present threat, sailors knew there would be little chance of aid were an attack to occur, as the longer a ship and its crew idled in the water, the more vulnerable everyone became. Despite the risk, many rescue missions did follow German assaults, and the heroism shown at sea would help bring 10,549 of the 12,000 merchant mariners home.
I'd like to welcome you, Carl, to Militaria, and you brought an interesting item for us today.
We have here a marine chronometer. A marine chronometer is an extremely precise clock used in navigating the ship. So it has some special features for being used at sea. And one is that the chronometer is able to move independently of the box that it's in. This way, the chronometer stays level when the ship rolls and pitches. There's a lock so that you can lock it in place if you're going to move it somewhere. There's a key here that's used to wind it. It had to be wound every 2 days.
And the need to have accurate time would be?
In order to navigate the ship, the navigator would take star sights or sun sights using a sextant, and he has to know exactly the time those observations were made. So the time is very important to be known exactly.
So there's an interesting story behind this particular chronometer.
This was installed in the Belgian Soldier, which was a freighter, traveling just off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland when it was struck by a torpedo from a German submarine.
The Belgian Soldier has an interesting story behind it because, again, it was owned by the Belgian government.
Yes, it was a British-built ship sold to Belgian Shipping Company and had been crossing the North Atlantic on several other convoys up to this point. The ultimate destination would have been the east coast of the U.S. to pick up more cargo and join another convoy eastbound to the United Kingdom.
So the essence of the convoys going back across the Atlantic, bringing supplies to basically the front.
Yes.
This was the lifeline between Europe and North America.
That's right. The trip from the UK back west took a couple of weeks with up to 80 ships in convoy. This was a constant shuttling back and forth.
And at this point, too, the German tactics of the U-boats were changing as well. The wolf packs are roaming the North Atlantic, and there's certainly areas across the North Atlantic which are danger zones. They were basically lying in wait. The Battle of Atlantic is probably a signature theater of operations that went from 1939 to 1945. As we sit here in Nova Scotia, that makes a big difference because, again, literally the Battle of the Atlantic was fought right off our doorstep. So this chronographer has a very interesting provenance. You know the whole story from ship right through to present day. It was basically up to one person that actually saved this, right?
Yes. Commanding officer of Sackville detailed Gerald Kent, his navigator, to lead a boarding party on board the Belgian soldier. And Gerald Kent, being a navigator, went straight to the navigation bridge. He made sure that the code books, the confidential books as they were called, were taken off because they hadn't been disposed of. Obviously, if they'd ever fallen into the hands of the enemy, would have been somewhat of a disaster. And him being a navigator, he recognized the value of this object here. I understand a sextant was salvaged as well, and a pair of binoculars.
The other interesting point is the fact that they actually were going out in a small whaling boat in the middle of the North Atlantic. You board a boat that's actually moving along to some degree, and to climb aboard it, grab it, and then come back out is more amazing than anything. They actually attempted to do that.
Yes, I mean, they took their lives in their hands. If one of the submarines that was in the area had decided to sink the Belgian soldier, could have happened when they were on board. As it turns out, it wasn't until the next day. So the men in that whaler were really, they had their lives in their hands and successfully got back to Sackville, of course.
The other interesting part is that actually the crew on the Belgian soldier, there was 60 people on that ship.
Yes, there was a large number of casualties because they were trying to launch lifeboats when the ship was still in motion. And that is nearly impossible to do that safely. So a lot of them lost their lives that way. The lifeboats were turned over. One actually got fouled up with the ship's propeller, which was partly out of the water, still turning, and it smashed the lifeboat, and the men that were in that boat drowned. All in all, it was tragic. There was one man left aboard. He was taken off by HMCS Sackville. There was another man in a lifeboat nearby, and he was also rescued.
I think the biggest takeaway in discussion is the fact that someone actually rowed out in the North Atlantic into a whaleboat to climb up the side of a ship that was still moving, pull that particular item out, and then live to tell its tale and bring it back and share that artifact years later. Thank you, Carl, for bringing this particularly interesting item. Obviously, it's technology, but it's old school technology we've seen today, but also the provenance of the story and how it relates back to the Sackville, which again is the only surviving corvette in the world.
Yes.
And the Sackville is basically Canada's naval memorial.
That's right, Canada's National Naval Memorial.
And this is displayed on the Sackville today?
We have had it in our display cases on board ship, also in the office on shore.
Thank you very much, Carl, for bringing it and also for highlighting the story of the Belgian soldier and HMCS Sackville today.
Well, thank you for having me. Well, I think it's interesting that the chronometer remained in the possession of the navigator. Many years later, he donated it to the Canadian Naval Memorial Trust. So it's part of our collection of artifacts now, and the story has come full circle.